Welcome to XpoNorth 2022 and this session, Writing Your Passion. I'm Peter Erpeth, XpoNorth's resident advisor in the writing and publishing sectors, and I'm delighted to welcome to the conference two of Scotland's finest writers, Coinneach MacLeod, who's just dropped in, the Hebridean Baker, and Malachy Tallack. Before introducing both to this stage, well, what of this session? Well, the nation's bookshelves, as I'm sure you're all aware, are full of books by authors who have successfully turned their passions, their hobbies, their interests, their chosen lifestyle or their culinary flair or sporting skills into best-selling books. But how do you turn your passion into pages of well-crafted, highly engaging work for others to engage with and enjoy? In this session, our esteemed guests will talk to us about how they approach their subjects to produce best-selling books that go far beyond the how-to and the self-help manual to capture and enthrall the imaginations of their readers. Now, our speakers. Coinneach MacLeod's The Hebridean Baker is an international publishing sensation. It is. And he has recently returned from a book tour of the USA. His frankly charming TikTok productions have a global following, having secured nearly 10 million views of his recipe and lifestyle videos. His unique style and wholesome and delicious traditional Scottish bakes have won him fans around the globe. And in this book, Coinneach shares his fabulous recipes, many drawn, I must say, from family and friends, along with stories of island life, offering a true taste of Scotland's wild and windswept Outer Hebrides. If I may add, the book has a killer family recipe for the mighty duff that I think all sentient beings should endeavour to experience at least once. And of course, a huge shout out to the team at Black and White Publishing for their stellar work with this book, which is a beautiful object, which makes everyone associated with publishing in Scotland very proud indeed. Now, due out in early July, Malachy Tallack's Illuminated by Water, which is published by Doubleday, explores the appeal of fishing, its intense joys and frustrations, the steadying effect it has, both at the water's edge and in the memory, and the contemplation of nature and landscape that comes with being an angler. But more, I think it's an exploration of a kind of deep longing to recapture a kind of childlike wonder. And I think that's a really striking kind of note in this book, very resonant. It's rooted in memory and experience that is, not a how-to in any kind of way, but an exploration of the why, of the need to do something as a kind of compulsion. Malachy is award-winning author of 3 books, most recently a novel, The Valley at the Centre of the World, published by Canongate. It was shortlisted for the Highland Book Prize and longlisted for the Royal Society of Literature's Ondarchie Prize. His first book, 60 Degrees North, was a BBC Radio 4 Book of the Week, and his second, The Undiscovered Islands, was named Illustrated Book of the Year at the Edward Stanford Travel Writing Awards. Malachy has deep connections with Shetland, where he moved to as a child, and currently lives in Stirlingshire. And just to say, if Coinneach and Malachy's island connections were not enough for this session, I can confirm that I'm hosting this session from my long-term home office on the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides. I think Coinneach's actually coming from a little further south on the same island. So this is very much an island takeover of XpoNorth. Now, we're going to start today with an introduction from both of these fine writers to their work, and I have copies of their books here. Many would have seen this, The Hebridean Baker, and lucky to get my hands on an advanced copy of Malachy's book. So that's there. That's the lovely artwork we have too. They're going to do an introduction, a reading, and for that, I suppose I'll come to Malachy first, if I can.
Thank you. I'm glad we all got the memo on the colour scheme of clothing. Yes, we're all matching.
Cool.
So, yeah, as Peter said, this book is kind of a why to rather than how to about fishing, and it is a book that I started writing during lockdown when I, like most people, were feeling all kinds of things, sort of trapped at home and kind of longing to be outside and longing for the freedoms and the kind of feelings of connection that were absent at that time. And one of the things that I found myself thinking about a lot was fishing, which was not allowed during the first lockdown. And it was something that I had done since I was a child. And I think, well, what I found myself thinking about really was that kind of childhood passion that many of us get about that singular obsession with a hobby or an interest. And I certainly had that with fishing when I was young, and I wasn't able to do it at that time. And so the next best thing to doing it was writing about it. And that was how this book began. But I will read just a short bit from the introduction just to give you a taste. I'm an angler, and I have been an angler since I was young. Few other labels sit so comfortably with me. Few can be applied as this one can without qualification. Angling is tangled in my memories, my daydreams, and my ambitions. It shaped the way I look at and notice the world, and the way I think about my place within it. It's the childhood obsession that failed to fade, the youthful fervour that never fully let me go. While almost everything else has changed in the years since I first went fishing, I can still find that same surge of adventure that drew me in and hooked me more than 3 decades ago. Angling and thinking about angling has been a precious constant in my life, even at times when I've fished less often than I've wanted to. Like listening to the songs I loved as a teenager, each return to the water feels like a return to myself. The poet and novelist Jim Harrison once wrote that fishing is the activity that ensures my sanity. And I know pretty much what he meant. Angling has a steadying effect for me, not just when I'm there casting or catching, but at other times too, remembering, imagining. It offers a connection to place that feels more intimate and multifaceted than most, and an engagement with the natural world that is knotty and compelling. It's an engagement of attention, certainly, but also an involvement in the lives and sometimes the deaths of those creatures the angler pursues. Like all hobbies, angling is both a way of wasting time and simultaneously a way of generating meaning from that time. Aylm Traveller has written that fishing is folly, useless, unreasonable, irrational, and without purpose. But she doesn't mean this as criticism. After all, how many of life's great pleasures are likewise useless? How much of what is most important is also without purpose? As Traveller puts it, fishing is folly precisely because it makes survival harder than it already is, and by doing so, turns survival into an art. It isn't necessary to feel certain about that word, art, in order to take her point, that angling creates its own kind of meaning, its own kind of significance. It is, she concludes, evocative beyond thought, the rings of water after a rise.
That's really beautiful. Thank you, Malachy. Now, just before coming to Coinneach for a similar reading, I must say, for those tuning in, if you've got questions, we'll take those later. And if you could use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom page rather than comments for those questions, and we'll be able to pick them up. So that said, welcome, Coinneach, and I'd like to hand over to you, if I may.
Well, Falcha Peter, Falcha Malachy, and everybody here. Great to see you all. And nice, I should say, to have a few islanders talking from home as well. So welcome from the Isle of Lewis. And well, I mean, and I think if it wasn't for that, if it wasn't for the identity, the culture, the language that I have because of being from Lewis, there's no way this book would have ever been written. If it wasn't for sitting by my auntie's stove in the next village of Maravig, talking of old stories of her wedding day, of ceilidhs, of recipes while she was slicing up a piece of clooty dumpling, or duff as we call it, on the island, this book would never be written. And what I think I'm most humbled about is the fact that the reason I started creating the content was actually to make sure that the people on the island remember these stories, and the fact that it's resonated not just on the island of Lewis and not just in Scotland, but these stories have resonated around the world is humbling and kind of wonderful at the same time. And quite honoured that my book was the best-selling Scottish cookbook last year, and now being released across the world in America and Canada and Australia and New Zealand over the past few months. And it's a real mix, and this is maybe where I hope that is that USP that we all strive for as authors. It's not just a cookbook, that is the genuine stories behind it of the islands. So as much as I hope that people will bake my Aunt Bellac's duff or try the whiskey ice cream or Highland cow cupcakes, actually I really want them to see the pictures from the islands and read the stories, because I think what I've learned is when I've been on the book tour around the US, and I'll be off to Canada next month, that it's those parts that are resonating even more than the recipes themselves. So in the book there's 8 stories, and so I'll just read the introduction of one of the stories to give you a kind of flavour of what you can imagine. And one of my favourite parts of living on the island is all the myths and legends we have. Every village has their own monster or their own thing that keeps you away from the lochs or seas. And we had the Echushka, and an Echushka is a shapeshifter who gives you the trust. They will fit into the shape of whatever character that you will trust the most, but then it never ends well. But I started the story by talking about the first story my mother ever told me. So I'll kind of introduce it that way. So this is from the chapter of Myths and Legends. The first story I ever remember my mother telling me was of 2 brothers who lived just down the road from us in the village of Calabost. These brothers were no ordinary siblings, as they were both giants. One day, when out gathering their sheep, they fell out over which path home they should walk the flock. The older brother, Taramat, began to climb the path to the south, and his younger brother, Torfi, took the path to the north. They continued to argue, shouting Gaelic insults at each other across the glen. Torfi picked up a rock the size of a cow and threw it at his brother. The rock bounced off Taramat's shoulder and smashed into 1,000 pieces and rolled down the hill to the shoreline. In a rage, Taramat lifted the biggest rock he could find and threw it at Torfi, who at exactly the same time threw another rock at his brother. The brothers weren't to know that the rocks they heaved into the air had been cursed by the Banshee, a fairy woman, and as they hit, would turn them both to stone. Now, when you visit the village of Calabost, you will see 2 very rocky hills by the shoreline called Mull na Braharan, the Brothers' Beach, which are made up of all the stones that rolled down to the shoreline that fateful day. My mother would take me there when the sun shone, and I would always run past those hills as fast as I could with my eyes closed, in case the giants might see me and cast their final cursed stone.
Thank you very much. I think both of these readings kind of illustrate something which I suppose might be a little bit of an aside in a way, but something I want to touch on straight away because of these 2 books, and these we're talking about, is the element of kind of how strong a role your own childhood plays in these books. They both seem to want to, in a way, reach back in a very positive way. And I'm also reminded of a quote I read many years ago by a writer called Gaston Bachelard, who made the phrase that childhood is intense before it is complex. And I was struck by the idea that both of these books actually are kind of reaching back towards a kind of intensity of experience. I just wondered how you kind of went about trying to turn that into words on a page. How does one capture that kind of experience? I mean, Malachy, your book is full of intense experience in a way, you know, that leaps out beyond the complex. How do you find the words and the style for that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I think that when we're talking about these kinds of passions, hobbies and pastimes and interests, these nearly always are things that we find in childhood. Children become obsessed and excited easily, and they develop these hobbies and interests that can kind of consume them. And for most people, that's kind of gradually dies down as they get older, and they become more self-conscious, I suppose, and they find other things that complicate their lives. But for the lucky ones, they keep hold of some of those hobbies, and those will accompany them through their lives, as fishing has for me. And so inevitably, when I go to write about something like fishing, I have to start by going back to the root of that. The very first chapter in this book, I write about the first time I went fishing. I'm sure many children are taking fishing and maybe they don't catch anything. Maybe it just doesn't appeal to them for some reason. But for a lot of people, they go, and there is something incredible about this experience of managing to pull these magical creatures out of the water, these creatures that you never would have known were there unless you went fishing. And it just, for me, it made the world feel like a bigger, more exciting and mysterious place. And so when I want to write about it, going back to that first time and thinking about that experience, and I can remember it quite vividly still, really helped me to get to the root of what it is that I'm still finding pleasurable about fishing.
And what about you, Coinneach? I mean, your book is full of early memory and of kind of very, warm experience and memory and so on of your early days here on the Isle of Lewis.
Well, I wondered if maybe because I came into this book in a slightly different way to many as writers, where I had the chance through my kind of social platforms to understand better what my tone of voice should be, what my audience were interested in. And so I over the kind of previous 2 years, where I was creating content, and a lot of the content I was creating was, yes, making recipes, but as the voiceover, telling stories or anecdotes about family, be it on my TikTok or my podcast. And so I started to learn very early on what my kind of core call to action should be. That, yes, I was a baker, but what people bought into was the character, my geographical identity, and my storytelling. Luckily, that's one thing I got from my father. Was I got my height from my mother, luckily, because my father was only 5'7", but I definitely got my storytelling from my father. And so I learned that the storytelling part was a very important thing that people were enjoying as I created this safe environment, warm environment for people to live in with me. And as a result, the stories, and going back to your question about the where the stories came from and how important they are, I wonder if it's the fact that for me, the stories of my youth, a bit like that story I told about the first story my mother ever told me. I probably over the years have added, like I know my mother probably didn't tell me the names of the two characters, just called them the brothers. And then maybe I call them two names. And then maybe I added a wee bit more story to it. So as you mature as a kind of child to a teenager to an adult, your creativity is added to the creativity of the people around you. And I think that's where a lot of the stories came from. There's a story about my father meeting the Queen. And I know in the book, and I know there's probably 16 different versions of that story. Every house in the village of Cremore has a different version of that story, depending on how many dramas my father had before he's told the story. So I think it's a little bit of that, is that as a writer, your inner creativity is shaping the stories that are central to your either family life or geographical life. And so I hope that's where I have got my creativity from.
And the thing about this is that both of your books also include quite a lot of kind of external reference. You draw on things, you draw on folklore and history, you quote from people, as well as your own personal experience. Now, obviously, in the cookbook, you've got demarcations in a kind of natural way. You know, a chapter ends and you go into some recipes. But how conscious were you of the need to balance these kinds of elements, these different elements, and how of the different types of material, as it were, and how difficult did you find that process to actually find a balance that was your voice, the voice of others, and so on, and to blend that into something that wasn't, too much leaning in a kind of study direction, or too much in a otherwise narrative direction.
Well, maybe Mark, if I start on that, I think maybe for me it was quite simple. I had amazing publishers who just said, Coinneach, just write your favorite stories and we'll figure out if they if they fit into a book. Because as you say, of the structure of mine, I could think of my book more as 8 short stories rather than a novel. And so maybe I have a slight advantage over Mallachy, where I can take myths and legends as one chapter and then go on a completely different tangent on chapter 2. So the concept of writing short stories I found really rewarding, and definitely has inspired me to think, could I write kind of long form novels? But at this stage, that ability to capture somebody's imagination in 1,500 words, I've really enjoyed that style of writing.
Well, I'll answer that. And a question has just appeared in the Q&A from Felicity Martin, and my answer, I think, addresses that directly, is that when you're writing any book, but perhaps particularly a non-fiction book, then thinking about how to structure it is one of the key questions and complications to making the book work. You can't just spew out everything you know about a subject, because nobody will be able to read it. And so thinking about how to structure, how to arrange things to make it work for the reader was one of the really big things I had to think about quite early on, before I knew that this book could actually work. I didn't want it to be just an essay collection, essays on fishing. So the way that I went about it was, rather than a structure, this book has a rhythm. So the chapters alternate between chapters about a place. So they're essentially about particular fishing trips or series of fishing trips to a place. So there are a couple of chapters about fishing in Shetland, one about fishing in New Zealand, and those alternate with chapters about a particular subject or an idea that I found interesting about fishing. So the first one of those is about memory. There's one about freedom. There's one about the ethics of fishing. And so those kind of just go back and forth through the book. And that was enough, I found, to provide the structure that I needed, the kind of rhythm to make this book readable and to make it feel cohesive and coherent, I suppose.
And did that structure come out of kind of, did you predetermine that, or did that emerge out of the writing process?
So it came quite early on. A couple of the pieces in the book about places I had written versions of before and published them in fishing magazines. And then very early in lockdown, I started tying my own flies again, which I had not done since I was a teenager. I couldn't go fishing, so I was going to tie flies. And I found the whole process, both of buying the equipment and thinking about, well, what flies do I want to tie, really fascinating. And I started to write notes about this, and it started to come together as an essay. And so at that point, I had this couple of pieces about places, and I had this piece that was sort of coming together about tying flies and the kind of creativity involved in that. And then I started to get a sense, well, these are very different. So possibly I started to make notes about what I might want to write about. And then it occurred to me, okay, we have two very distinct kinds of chapters here. And perhaps that will be enough, that rhythm, to make it work.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. What about you, Coinneach? I mean, the thing about did you think that you had to do something kind of new with the cookbook? Because cookery in Scotland, cookbooks in Scotland are, some amazing work over recent years and beautifully published and so on. How aware were you of the kind of field that you were writing in, and did you want to address that in some sort of new way?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we all strive for the USP that we have in the marketplace, and I suppose if there are, and I'm sure there is, budding writers and authors on listening today, is understanding what is it that a publisher would look for in a new author's work, and that I was quite inspired by, there was this lecture by Alan Wells, the What If Money Was No Object. I don't know if any of you have listened to that. And it talks about if you're passionate about something, you'll find others that are as passionate about it. And that's really what's happened. And so part of it for me was creating a character. Luckily, the character is me. I didn't need to change me to be this character of the Hebridean Baker. But what came along with that was that identity of a kind of Hebridean man who would be out in the hills one in the morning, but then baking in the afternoon, then sing Gaelic songs in the evening. But luckily, it wasn't forced, because that's basically what my life is like pretty much every day. So there was a character identity that allowed people to understand very quickly before they bought the book what they should expect from the book. And I think that's a big part now of the kind of factual marketplace, is because a lot of authors in that format, be it cookbooks or others, often come from the digital or social media world, because that allows the publishers to be able to go to visualize from the content that's being created. And so it's quite an advantage for a lot of authors of my type who can showcase their work for potential publishers to be able to take on. So but I would say what was very important for me was the, as I said, the geographical identity, being the Hebridean Baker. Although I sometimes wish I was the Malibu Baker, because the weather would be much nicer there. But I'm now stuck being the Hebridean Baker. So what comes with that? What comes with that is the identity and culture and language and recipes and flavors. Be it whiskey or marmalade or brambles or whatever comes with it. So I don't think I needed to do, I wasn't looking to be particularly innovative with the recipes or the stories. I was trying to hark from my identity to people that maybe weren't that aware of it, or people who were from the islands, to make them so proud that somebody was promoting what for them is day-to-day life. So that were my kind of two core aspects.
I mean, I think it's interesting because I think accessibility is a big part of that, isn't it? You know, your book, your recipes are and indeed the way that the stories are written is there to actually make the whole experience that you outline actually accessible to a very wide, you know, to anyone who wants to have it. Really, you know, were you kind of aware of a kind of a reader that you were writing for in doing that?
Yes, I very much was, actually. From the point of view of the recipes, when I started creating content online, it was during the time when we were all craving some kind of creative release, you know, during lockdown when folk were at home. And so the two things I wanted to do, which was in contrast to many other creators, they were making the biggest cake or the most buttercream or the most layers. And I thought to myself, who's eating all these things? Because we're not allowed to leave the house at the moment. So I wanted to make things that were just for you or just for two of you, you know. I always told them, make it in a small tin, do this, do that. So it was very much about making people the best home baker, or when your auntie could come round and visit, this was a recipe that she would enjoy having. So that was that kind of audience from the food perspective was very, very much there. So it wasn't the goal of making anybody into a Michelin star chef in any way. It was absolutely to make them the best home baker in their village. That was my goal. And from the stories perspective, as I said, initially it very much was this, that I wanted to make the island folk very proud of the stories that we have. And for them to be able to go, I know that story, I love that story, or I've heard that story before, or I know that loch, or I know that auntie, I've seen her in the co-op in Stornoway, whatever. So to make them proud of the people that are about. And again, what I've really enjoyed doing the tours, basically if it's in New York or Stornoway or Tarbert or San Francisco, is that the connections with the islands have come in every city I've been to. And I'm quite humbled about how pleased people are that the Hebrides, and particularly the Isle of Lewis, where I'm from, are being celebrated again, the way that we always want them to be.
Malachy, did you, when you were writing this book, did you have a sense of who you were writing for? You know, who that was?
Yeah, it's interesting because if I was speaking to somebody who was going to write their first book, I would probably advise them not to worry too much about who their reader was, because I think that can be it can get you in a tangle, really. You can, especially with your first book, you can only write the book that you can write. And if you worry too much about who the reader is, you can end up not writing like yourself, or end up not writing the book that is the best book that you can do. But funnily enough, this also was a book that in part came out of thinking about who the ideal reader was, or the kind of readers that I might like, because I knew from the start that I wanted this to be a book that could be read by people who did not fish. I didn't want to write. There are a lot of fishing books out there. I think there are probably hardly any hobbies that have, perhaps cooking actually, but hardly any other hobbies that have as many books written about them, but they are almost all written for people who already do it. And I wanted this to be a book that could be read by people who might read just another book about nature. or about being outside. I wanted it to be open in that sense, that anyone who had any kind of interest in the outdoors would be able to pick this book up and find that it appealed to them in some way. So I did have to keep that in mind as I wrote and think about what is the level of knowledge that I'm expecting from a reader here? What's the kind of background expectation? What do I need to say that I might otherwise take for granted with a reader? And that was really helpful in thinking about how to write these pieces and and the need to express exactly what it was that I find so fascinating about this subject. Imagining a reader who knows almost nothing about it forces you to say more, forces you to go that little bit further than you otherwise would. And so, as I say, I would often tell, if I were teaching a writing workshop or something, I might say, don't worry too much about the reader at this stage. That's kind of the publisher's job to think about. But sometimes, and in this case, it helped me. It helped me get this book right.
I mean, I think that's really interesting, because I think particularly with your book, I think there's I introduced this as a book about angling, about fishing, but I think much more importantly, it isn't a book about fishing. It's a book about the word you use a lot, need, and that to some extent your subject is an exploration about the manifestation of something that's shared by a lot of people, which manifests itself in all sorts of different ways, which is a kind of need and a kind of longing. And I think that is, I mean, do you think that that's actually the real subject of your book? Is that longing? You identify it very early on. And you must have had a sense of a sort of a community that shares that sort of feeling.
Well, it's a book about joy, partly, about joy. And I mean, the subtitle is Nature, Memory, and the Delights of a Fishing Life. It is partly about joy. I wanted and needed at that time to be writing about pleasure, sources of pleasure, and the weirdness of that. Part of what's fascinating about fishing is that it's so ridiculous, and in some ways there's a similarity with baking, perhaps, in that it's something that arises out of a need for food. Both fishing and baking are partly potentially about food, but they become more than that. They become complicated and cultural. And I've lost my way with the question slightly there.
About need.
But also about that longing for connection with the world, that need for a feeling of connection with the outdoors that, of course, at that time that I started writing, we couldn't have.
What's interesting in that, Peter, and you might have heard this word as well in Gaelic, called Cianalus. Cianalus is just as a translation, it's kind of being homesick or longing or nostalgia, but often it's for a place you've never been to. It's for a place in your mind, somewhere in your mind, that you imagine or hope for. And actually, I think that's a lot of why people bought into there's something in them that it could just be Scottish, or it could be island life, but that deep kind of seated sense of belonging to a place where your roots are, which of course, because it's in Gaelic, normally is attributed then to the islands. But I think that concept of Cianalus, maybe Malachy, that's maybe rooted in yours as well, because it's certainly rooted in mine. And when I get feedback, that's a big part. And people say, I've never been, but I feel like I have because of your stories or some sense in me that I want to be connected to that place.
Yeah, I mean, there's I recognize that feeling very strongly, and I think it is also connected to the longing that we carry for, not strictly for childhood, but a sense of childishness, almost the childlike wonder that we had at that age. I think that as adults we long for that simplicity, and so writing about these kinds of passions can bring us closer to those.
Do you find that the act of writing itself is the same pursuit as that in many ways, isn't it? I think, that actually to write is to connect in some ways to that same feeling of intensity. I mean, to write creatively in this kind of way, that is an action itself that connects into that feeling of wonder, certainly of freedom and of imagination and so on, the hallmarks of a good childhood.
It can be. I often find writing a bit more of a chore than that. I would rather be fishing than writing. But this certainly, I'm going back to a kind of conversation we were having slightly earlier, writing about, I think that particularly when we're beginning to write, perhaps people writing their first book or their first essays and so on, we're often drawn to things that feel complicated, things that trouble us, difficult subjects, trauma, and so on. And suddenly, my first book was partly about grief. Writing this book, writing a book about joy and passion, was both easier and much more pleasant an experience than any writing. I mean, I enjoyed writing this book far more than I have ever enjoyed writing anything before. So it's a kind of great revelation to discover that I could have been doing this all along.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of these touch on the need for these for books like this, the ones that really stick out, have a kind of universality to them that is way above and beyond their subject matter in its particular, that it has to communicate in a much broader and bigger way. There are memoirs and anything that has memory in it and so on. To want to read about that, I think the reader needs to feel that there's actually a message that speaks directly to them about their experience, and perhaps how did that play in your work?
Well, that's true, but I also think that other people's obsessions can be fascinating, even if you have no interest. I mean, I would love to read a book about someone's obsession with stamp collecting, just somebody who can really express what it is about that gets them excited. I think the things that interest other people can be really interesting because they're not what you are interested in.
Just picking up what Leslie said about belonging and place, and that definitely for me is a huge part of this. As I said, being the Hebridean Baker, that's a really important thing. In writing, though, what I realized unintentionally is that I had the structure to my writing that I didn't really even know I had, and now I actually really, and then looking back on when I started writing the stories, making the story as visual as possible, that people could nearly feel, I don't know, in like a Doctor Who or Outlander way, whatever, that they were in part of the story. So very much that kind of picture it type of way without the pictures. And I would always start the stories. Just now I'm writing a story about the herring girls, about the ladies of the islands who would travel from Shetland all the way down to Yarmouth and got the herring and the stories that went along with that. But my granny was one of them. So rather than it being from the perspective of an education part about the herring girls, which is part of the story, I start with it by the perspective of imagining my granny, getting on the mail boat to Loch and then getting the train up to Aberdeen, and then the ferry, and what did she have in her quiche, in her big what's the English word for that, like case, suitcase kind of thing, what was in it. So people could imagine her kind of packing away all her things from the village, and then going away and singing Gaelic songs on the train with people from other villages she hasn't seen for a long time. But then telling people about the Herring Girls, so giving that little bit of education, but through that kind of hopeful charm of an individual. And that's my format of stories, which I didn't go out thinking that's the way I was going to write, but now I really enjoy that style of writing, and now I realize that is the format I write in, and I hope that people buy into these mini characterizations through these stories.
Yeah, so interesting. Can I just move on a little bit, and that is, Malachy, can I ask you about how you went about having your book published? How did you take this to your agent and a publisher? Because it's quite a, when you read the book, you think, well, of course, but it's actually quite a difficult thing to encapsulate and to describe and to pitch, for want of a better word.
Yeah, it is. And I don't know if it's been a good thing or a bad thing that all of my books have been just completely different. So every time I go to my agent, Jenny Brown, and say, here you go, here's a new one, she has to think differently about it. I was helped, I think, I'll be honest here, I was probably helped by the success of the TV program Gone Fishing, Bob Mortimer and Paul Whitehouse, because I think that is a program that's watched by a lot of people who never fish. And so the evidence was there that if you get it right, people will take an interest. But I sold it as what it is, really, a book that tries to get to the root of this obsession that, even though, fishing is not, as it was once, the most popular participatory sport in the UK. Huge numbers of people. It's not quite as popular as that now, but there's still a lot of people who fish. And so I had to write a proposal. Of course, as you do, the proposal gets sent in with sample chapters or with the whole book. And I just had to explain what I had tried to write a book that would appeal both to those people who fish and to the kind of people who might go to the nature writing shelf in Waterstones and see what was new. And not every publisher thought that I'd got it right, but this particular publisher was extremely enthusiastic about the book, and so that was very lucky.
Yeah, and I mean, was that a kind of, in the end, was there a kind of a lot of, a kind of a big editorial approach to this? Did you feel that you had to change the book or adapt it or anything? Or was it, was it taken, as is? They got it.
No, when I finished the book and got my edits back, I had about a page and a half of notes about changes they wanted. It was almost nothing. So it was a very easy editorial process. They were pleased with the approach that I had taken. So that was a relief. I mean, these things are, submitting to publishers is always, or I always find it an awful experience. I think, you have to trying to sell your book to somebody and tell them why they should buy it, why they should then try and sell it to readers is not an enjoyable. It's kind of one of the worst things about writing a book is that last bit where you then go and try and sell it to publishers and think in those kind of marketing terms that are often not the way that writers think at all. But it's necessary,
And your book is, of course, agented. You know, you have an agent. I mean, did you feel the benefit of that? You know, is that something that you would sort of recommend for a
Yeah, of course, of course. Some publishers will take books from people without agents, but a lot of editors will never read a book that doesn't come from an agent. They'll never read a book that comes from the writer. This publisher would be one of those. I would have got there without an agent.
Yeah, interesting. Now, your own experience kind of was quite different in this case. You know, you had a publisher who was wanted to do this book. What was that process then? So if you're approached and so on, how did that work?
Yeah, so absolutely right. Very, very different indeed. And I was approached by a couple of different publishers in the US and in Scotland. What that does then, it very, very quickly makes you think, okay, what am I offering? Because the difference for me was I wasn't going with a concept, a written concept. I was going with this storyline of my social content that I had, and then formalizing that into what is a very, very competitive market. The cookbook market in the UK is pretty competitive. Oh my goodness, in the US, it is unbelievable. Like in the UK, there is 2 key seasons for those who are more into that. The writers on today who are more into writing about, it could be knitting or sewing or what you know, cooking or drawing, whatever. There are often 2 very clear seasons. That is the September to October market, which is the lead up to Christmas. Then there is a smaller market in March, which you see the release of cookbooks. In the US, when I went over and I did a couple of book signings in dedicated bookshops that were dedicated to cookbooks. And now I follow them on social media, and they will often have maybe 15 to 20 new releases of cookbooks every week. And so how do you kind of punch through that to that marketplace? And so I knew that I couldn't just be another cookbook author. I couldn't just be the one with 100 recipes in the book. And even being Scottish definitely wasn't enough, because there are amazing Scottish, I mean, Sue Lawrence, you know, for example, an amazing Scottish author and chef who I can never imagine being the kind of quality or things that she does. So I always knew there was going to be more to it. And John is just right in there about the importance of Gaelic, or the reaction of Gaelic in the book and in my kind of storylines. And again, this has been, you know, the delight, Peter, for those of us who do speak Gaelic, because we are unique. There's probably 60,000 of us that speak Gaelic. And so from that, the interest and the amount of people who have come to me saying, I've started learning Gaelic because of, you know, your videos counting to 10 in Gaelic, or a story you wrote in the book, is unbelievable. The amount of times around the US when we met people who were speaking Gaelic, who started learning Gaelic, was fantastic. So again, having the uniqueness of identity or culture or language is a big part of what publishers will look for these days. And yes, there are trends. And at the moment, Malachy, you talked about that fishing show that you were mentioning. Well, during lockdown, when travel shows couldn't go to Rio, New York, and Moscow, for example, what you saw, a lot of them, be it Joanna Lumley or Ben Fogel or all these people, where were they going? They were coming to the Hebrides, because for England, we're quite exotic now. We're quite different. You know, they come to the islands and they see something that they don't see in the rest of the British Isles. And so there was, again, a bit like what you said, Malachy, there was a wave of opportunity that people suddenly were taking an interest, again, be it because of Outlander, be it because of other things in the islands. So a wee bit of luck for me as well, I think, which we all need.
I just want to come to this one question that cuts back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier, from Felicity, do the two authors feel there is a development in the characters themselves within the books? If so, is this reflecting real life or the purpose of the narrative?
I hate to answer questions like this with no. So I'll try and say something a bit more than that. It was a book that was written. There's a development in the sense that the book mostly starts out with writing bits about childhood and gradually moves forward to the present day, but it doesn't have the kind of development, I think, of the character development, self-development that I think Felicity is asking about, which is a disappointing answer, perhaps, but I'll hand over.
Well, I think it's maybe easier for me to answer this because I can see a development because it's about recipes. So as a result, as I go on to future projects, I have to develop more recipes or be more creative or maybe less rustic, a little bit more elegant or a different storyline. And so I have to learn new recipes or create new recipes to be able to continue this journey that I am on, and be that taking advantage of different cultures. Or I mean, one of my favorite things to do is a day with old Scottish cookbooks like F. Marion McNeill's The Scots Kitchen, for example, and poring over it and saying, okay, how could I twist this or what could I do with that? So I think I'm maybe quite lucky that as a cookbook author, I can see a development in myself because I need to continue to learn and create these new recipes.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Well, I'm aware that we're down to the last few minutes. Thanks very much for both of your contributions. So can I just ask what comes next then for both of you to close? Do you have as this one's published, do you have a book on the go? Do you have a subject that you're on? I mean, I know you can't always give information away like that, but how do these things sit together?
Well, almost inevitably, because of how slow publishing tends to be, by the time a book comes out, you're well on your way with the next project. This book was quite quick. It was submitted to a publisher last summer and is coming out this summer. That's actually pretty fast for publishing. I have another novel sitting with a publisher that I'm not sure when it's going to come out, but it hopefully will come out. I'm working on another one after that. So going back to fiction.
Okay.
Similar. I had an amazing 2021. 2022 is kind of become unbelievable with all the opportunities that have come with it, and many of them have come from having a book. Once you have your first book, it brings other opportunities around that. But yes, if I had a crystal ball, it wouldn't need to be too far in ahead to hope that there is a new one coming out. But also the fact that there are, I think, different things that I would like to write about, and I've started writing in a very different style now to complement the cookbook, and that will be my first adventure, going to publishers, going, what do you think of this idea? So Mallachy, I might be coming to you for some advice on that.
Well, yeah, very good place to go. Well, look, thank you so much, both of you, and both of these books. Mallachy, I think yours is due very soon, July.
July 7th, yeah. July
7th. Well, good luck for that. I know it's going to be very, very well received. And of course, there it is, the Hebridean Baker. That's on the shelves already. And thank you both so much for your contributions today. Very enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks so much.
Thanks.